Christian has very kindly offers to give us a talk on the Northwest Passage, isn't it, Christian? Which yes. I think is the road to libertarianism. And Christian has never been given us a bad talk yet. And so I'm looking forward that by the fallacy of induction, I expect that this will be another excellent talk.
Okay, I'll stand up probably, and it's yes. The idea of the talk was to answer the question, or try to answer the question, where do we go from here to the freer society that we aspire to? And I've called it the Northwest Passage because it's one of these sort of mythical movement in history, and so I thought it would be an attractive title. But I'm going in analyzing this passage to use Marx's analysis of history as the best account of how history moves and unfolds, and how we get from one stage of society to another. And two Marxist concepts are going to be useful, I think, here. One is class struggle, and the other one is ideology. And one of the features of today's ideology, one of the tenets, is to say that there isn't class struggle any longer. It's over, it's done. I think if you do this, yeah, okay, we'll probably find it.
Thank you very much.
So, you know, no more class struggle. We are all middle class today. That was one of the motto of the sort of last 40 years. And democracy has abolished class struggle because we can all vote and we can all get what we want out of the state simply by using the ballot box. But I will maintain that class struggle still very much exists, and what Marx has said, you know, famous opening sentence of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle, is something that is with us, that we live, that we suffer from every day in our life. The idea of class struggle is developed by Marx in sort of three stages. I mean, the very first one was slavery. Marx says slave masters are rich, they have political and legislative powers, and they exploit their slaves. Feudal lords, which is the next step, feudal lords are rich, they have political and legislative powers, and they exploit their serfs. And then Marx arrives at the capitalist stage of society and says, you know, the bourgeois are rich, and then they don't have, as bourgeois, as capitalists, political and legislative power. And that is a problem for Marx, because how can he explain that there is exploitation without that? It is simply by saying that capitalists are rich is the fallacy of correlation and causation that Russell, you know, famously described. And this man drinks gin and vodka and gets sick, and drinks vodka and gin and tonic and gets sick, whiskey and tonic and gets sick, and vodka and tonic and gets sick, and says tonic makes me sick. So I'm drinking tonic right now, and I don't think it's going to make me sick. So in the first tome of The Capital and in The Poverty of Philosophy, Marx tries to get around this. He says, yes, workers are not subject to discrimination on, you know, political and legislative grounds. They are free, but it is abstract freedom. We say, tells Marx, that the worker is free because nobody knocks at his door at, you know, 5 o'clock in the morning and drags him screaming and kicking to the factory floor. But that is simply the factor of alienation. It is the mark of alienation that the worker doesn't understand that he is actually being enslaved. So if we accept that the class struggle, that class struggle continues, but that the workers are not the exploited class, who is the exploiter? Who are the protagonists in the class struggle? And obviously, very obviously, the ruling class today is the class of state employees, state bureaucrats, and people who live from the state, subsidized farmers, subsidized artists, in other words, the ruling class of state bureaucrats and their lackeys. Why did Marx not identify that these were the obvious protagonists? And I think for a couple of reasons. I mean, the first one is that the state at the time of Marx was very limited in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. It didn't have, it was growing, but it had not reached the stage that it reached after the First World War. So maybe it was a bit difficult to identify that the state was really, as the class, as a class of employees and so on, a ruling class. Albeit it had its culture, public service, it had its, and very blatantly was exploiting the population of producers and so on because of the tax system. But there is another reason why Marx failed to identify this. It's his adoption of the labor theory of value. I mean, originally, I think the original sin is really Locke, who said that property arises by mixing one's labor with some previously unowned good. The idea, of course, was simply establishing property, not establishing the value of property, which is a very different aspect. But from Locke, Adam Smith continued with this idea that it was labor that created value, and very much so Ricardo, who said that only value is really created by labor. And when you object to Ricardo, well, what about old Bordeaux wines, for instance? They require no more work than little wines from the Hérault or Languedoc region and so on. So Ricardo says, well, forget wines, it's an exception. So what about works of art? A sculpture that I could do would take me just as much time as a sculpture by Bacon. And forget works of art. So if you take all the list of things that are exceptions, you wonder what is left of the labor theory of value. But it was important to Karl Marx because it was the way of establishing that it was a capitalist who was the whoops, an invasion. And it was a way of establishing that the capitalist class was indeed the exploiting class. Marx develops this idea of his labor theory of value already in 1847 with first book, Wage, Labor and Capital, and then of course the following year in the Communist Manifesto. And he revisits the issue in two books of 1867, and notably in the tome 1 of Capital. And then he struggles with the concept through the rest of the decade of the 60s and in the 70s, and cannot finish the Capital. He cannot finish the Capital, tome 2 and tome 3, and you wonder what happened. And I'm not a scholar, but I will leave this thought with you. I don't know if somebody has. I haven't seen this developed anywhere. But in 1871, Karl Menger comes up with the principles of economic policy, where he develops the subjective theory of value, which is the core of the Austrian school. And I suspect that Marx, who read absolutely everything was published, especially in German, he could not have failed to read Menger's book, which was very popular, was quite successful and so on. And I think when he read this, Marx went, because his whole edifice crumbled. It was obvious that the subjective theory of value is a lot more powerful to explain what's taking place in the economy. And when Marx read this, he didn't write anything on economy after that.